Welcome to Promise Day. We're excited to have you join today's podcast with a man who's developed a practice helping people with the practical nature of budgeting and managing issues related to money. He has navigated complicated and simple family dynamics and has helped folks double check paperwork that goes out to other professionals like tax accountants and other financial professionals like CPAs. And it's important to recognize that not everyone needs or has an estate planner or someone who can help with a large amount of real estate or portfolio. Regardless, getting a handle on your costs and the things that you are spending money on is particularly important when you're moving into a fixed income period of your life. So we're excited to have you listening today. And as always, if you have questions, we're reachable at podcast@promiseday.com. Welcome, listeners, to the Promise Day podcast. Welcome back. Welcome for the first time. We're excited that you're here. We're excited that our guest John Hall's here. I'm excited to be speaking and learning again with Ashwini. My name's Aaron. My co-host of the Promise Day podcast is Ashwini Iyer, and we're building a company together and a podcast together in the elder space and the aging space. Promise Day is a brand created to help us age as independently as we can. For as long as we can. And the only way to do that is for us to be informed. And it's much easier to work together if we're all informed with the same information. So that's what we're aiming to do here today. And with all the conversations that we have, bringing individuals and the people that they love most together, bringing me and my family together, you and your family together, Ashwini and her family together, and our guests and their families together, and our friends together, the people we love most, families of choice and families of birth and otherwise. So we're excited to have you back today to the podcast. Ashwini is going to introduce our guest, and we're going to dive into the conversation.
Yes, I'm very excited today to welcome John Hall to our podcast. He is a really great resource for seniors and their caregivers when it comes to financial budgeting and preparation for the financial expenses they may have later on in life. I'll have John explain in detail exactly how he helps, because I think it's better to come from the source. But I want to give a little bit of background about how John and Aaron and I met. So John, Aaron, and I met a couple months ago in a senior course that we all took together to learn more about the experiences of aging and how we can best assist our own families specifically, but also those that we know and potential customers as they experience, the natural transitions in life. So, John, I'll hand it over to you to give us a little bit of context.
Thanks. It's great to be with both of you. I did get quite a bit out of that course. I am by trade a daily money manager, focused primarily on the senior population and their families and caregivers. So I partner often with caregivers, with assisted living facilities, with home care, but also with certified financial planners, CPAs. So I see myself as a personal CFO in that I'm not the person making all the decisions, but I am the glue among all of these different stakeholders that are essential for a senior facing a change in living conditions. My mission really is helping clients to manage their cash flow, to ensure that their investments are viable and that their short-term and long-term goals can be met. Because I am a daily money manager and not a financial planner or advisor, my focus is on, first of all, ensuring that the client and their family has a budget that they can really believe in, that they have thought through, that has been vetted against various potential economic conditions, takes into account variable costs, fixed costs, changes in income, inflation. And then beyond the budget, I provide help in how they can shop in a way that maximizes their savings. If they need their financial records organized in a way that helps their tax preparer to optimize their taxes, then that is something I can do too. Can also prepare taxes. They are relatively simple. If you are a person that has a living decision to make, i.e., you have a home and you're trying to decide whether to sell it or not, or whether to move and keep the house and rent it out, or whether you are, let's say, years away from retirement, but you're trying to plan ahead for your retirement and you have some sort of a real estate decision to make. That is also something where I have background in. I've been a real estate investor for over 20 years. I have over 20 years experience in healthcare finance. I worked for Kaiser Permanente for most of that tenure, but also with Stanford and UCSF. So I have an understanding of Medicare, the variations of options for Medicare, interpreting medical bills, and helping you to plan for covering your healthcare expenses, whether they're anticipated or not. That's my background in a nutshell, as well as what I aim to do as a personal CFO and a financial partner for seniors and their families.
So, as a financial planner, could you give our listeners a little bit of context in terms of how you fit into all of the support they might have around them? You know, some of our listeners have an accountant who helps with their taxes. They may have a formal financial planner or an estate manager. How do you work with those different individuals to help with the daily money management and also those long-term budgeting decisions?
So, while I don't propose and I certainly don't manage stocks and bonds and mutual funds, because of my background in finance and as an investor, I can be a second pair of eyes if somebody has a financial planner or an advisor or a wealth manager. Often I have found clients who have advisors that they generally trust and they're very hands off. But as I begin to work with them more, and I'm there in the trenches helping them manage their money day to day, they will ask if I can be a second pair of eyes to look at the overall asset allocation of somebody's portfolio. And again, if they have a real estate kind of question, I am in a position to offer advice, which is always data-based, on buying and selling particular pieces of property. Also, what some wealth managers may not do is run various scenarios. If a client, has 3, 4, 5 different scenarios involving retiring at different times, going into assisted living or home care or several other different scenarios based on their age. What I can do is develop very extensive Excel models that address all of those scenarios. In working with a CPA who may be preparing taxes, often the CPA is held up because the client doesn't have all of their documentation together. So that's something that I can help pull together, and I can be the direct conduit to the CPA.
I think what I hear from what you're saying is something that I don't know if people really appreciate. So stepping back for a second, as we get older, there are so many decisions that we have to make and things that we have to do, and they continue to compound if our families grow or if we have issues that we're managing. So when we're talking about money management, I do think it's important to highlight that as we get older, like, how are we thinking about shopping? Are we thinking about gifts? Are we thinking about food? How are we thinking about bills? Do we have mortgage to pay? Do we have rent to pay instead? What is that going to look like for me for the next year or two? What is it going to look like for me for the next 5 to 10 years if I need assisted help or need to move somewhere else to take care of myself? Talking about money becomes challenging. I mean, talking about health issues are challenging. Talking about money issues are challenging. How would you help us think about the kinds of things that kind of make those conversations easier?
Sure. Often it is helpful, especially if you have a senior and then you have their kids with maybe a philosophical dispute over a financial decision. Helpful to have a third party there, somebody neutral, somebody who's listening well, who is documenting and also thinking through the pros and cons of either side of the decision. I'll give you one example, and that is a client of mine lives south of San Jose. So they are in their early 80s, and I'm also working with their daughter, and this is one of their daughters. Her sister had been in charge of their finances, of actually paying bills. And then it turned out that she was actually stealing money from her parent. And so her other sister then took the reins and now went out and hired a daily money manager. Her parents had at first some skepticism about bringing in an outsider, and yet ultimately, by just listening, by showing sensitivity to what their predicaments were, I was able to win that responsibility over from their other daughter. There is a bit of a dispute within the family over what to do with the house that they and this is the client, the elderly client, they and their siblings own in Utah. They own a house that has been with that family for multiple generations, and selling it enables the couple to be able to reach all of their other financial goals, but there is an emotional attachment to that property. There is some potential to get some rent out of holding on to it. So my job has been to stay neutral, cost out the different scenarios, sell, keep and rent out. A third option is for them to actually move back to Utah and live in the house. I'm factoring in not only what the data tells me, but also what is best for their lifestyle. I do think having a third party who's more than a bean counter, who's listening, considering all aspects of a decision, being there is quite useful to smooth out the rough edges of what could be a really contentious situation.
I think it's also really hard because there are always even more scenarios to think through. So, it depends on the state that homes are in, but I know of certain tax laws in terms of tax brackets and real estate sales where if a couple is living in the house and then one of the people of that married couple dies, the state now treats taxes differently on the sale of that house. And so you might owe hundreds of thousands of dollars less to the government and be able to use that hundreds of thousands of dollars more for your own care. So not only now are you having a conversation around managing money for someone, now you're having a conversation around, can we talk about an outcome where it's not a couple anymore, but there's just one person who's alive? And suddenly, that could become all even harder to manage, right? So for our listeners and for ourselves, having these conversations like when we can is important, because there's always another one, right? There's always something else that's really meaningful that comes after what we just discussed, right? We're not just done having the conversation today. There's going to be another one, in a month or in 2 months, right? That comes up, and that can be really challenging.
And that's why it's helpful to have this third party, not only to, come in with a hired gun and try to address one issue, but to have that big picture in mind and know ahead of time what the tax implications and economic implications are under all kinds of scenarios that may not have even happened yet, but you've anticipated how to deal with those in your hip pocket. You pull it out if necessary. Another thing for people living in California that I've found is now an important factor in a similar kind of real estate deal where both of the parents have died, but now the heirs take title to the house. Under Proposition 19, after 1 year, the assessed value for property tax is now at the market rate under Prop 13 passed in the late 70s. It used to be that the heirs would retain the assessed value under that proposition, which is typically, like 1/5 or 1/6 of what it would be based on current market value. So yeah, knowing those kinds of things and factoring them in an analysis is obviously an important driver of the decision.
One thing I'd love
Yeah.
love to learn a little bit more about
Yeah.
is your process of doing this analysis for your clients. What are some specific stories you can share or examples you can provide us of the different types of scenarios that you think through? Because from the conversations that Aaron and I have had over the last couple months, that spend can vary significantly depending on what's happening. And a lot of people are living a lot longer than they're expecting to, which is a
Right.
wonderful problem to have, but can be very hard to budget for. So I'm kind of curious how you guide your clients through those kinds of conversations and how you think about those kinds of conversations.
Well, I'll give you a couple of examples. As I said, I have been primarily working with seniors, but my door is always open to people who are planning ahead to their senior years. And it so happens I had a client, she and her husband are in their 40s. So they're planning ahead to when they're in their mid 60s, trying to factor in where they may want to live and even factor in what kind of healthcare coverage they'll have. The wife is the primary breadwinner, and she wants to retire at 60. There's no Medicare, of course, until 65. So I had to go and do some estimating of what her health care might cost for those 5 years. But the bigger focus that they had was on some real estate decisions. So they were not too happy in the house that they're currently in. And then they were trying to decide whether to hold on to that house and buy another house and rent out the house that they're in, or sell the current house and buy another house. And then there were other considerations. Okay, what is that new house going to be? Is that their home forever, or is that a transition house that maybe has a little more room than the house they're in and has room for an ADU and a workshop and some things that just fit their lifestyle, maybe give them some income opportunities. So had to look at what their cash flow would look like under those situations. And I did review their investments in their company provided plan, which had really very few options. And so as a result, I did recommend when she retires at 60, roll that over into an IRA. Also had to look at, I did something that isn't often done by financial planners. I took a shot at modeling out what their income taxes would look like over 20 or 30 years. And I know it's not perfect, but it's better than making no assumption at all. So looked at tax brackets being indexed, which is the current law, and looked into whether there was an optimal period for them to do some Roth IRA conversions. It looked like, yeah, there was a 2 or 3 year period there when she's in her early 60s where that would be helpful. So there's a lot of kind of research that went into that, a lot of modeling, but above all, really listening and understanding what scenarios are really worth putting the time and effort into, and which ones are not, so that I'm using their time properly. Another example is I have a couple that is local, and they're in their late 70s. They in fact want to do now kind of a real estate deal, but they also are trying to sell a book. So they're still very enterprising folks, but having done their reporting, comparing it versus their budget, is that both because of their spending on this book enterprise, as well as what this real estate venture might cost, their cash flow is getting really crunched, and they're starting to realize it. And what's coming up here is I'm going to have to propose how much they should be withdrawing from their IRA, and also talking to their financial advisors. So making sure I understand what, the IRA is generally being invested in. And so what I want to be able to do is project a scenario where they're comfortably cash flow positive for the foreseeable future. And I want them to be certainly comfortable with that and have a lifestyle still that is appealing to them.
I think that one of the things that you talked about around like working with their current financial advisor is really key here. I mean, we've talked to others about having health teams work together in terms of physical health, and sometimes people aren't talking to each other. I know folks who have, tax planners and financial advisors, and they don't talk to each other, and I think that's crazy. Like if you've got a financial advisor and a tax planner, to me, it makes sense for those people to be able to talk to each other, to also make sure that they're using information to help you out, and that if I don't have enough time to talk to one or the other, and I make sure that they have time to talk to each other and share that information, then everybody wins. And to be able to be in such a wonderful situation that you have a financial advisor and have someone else that can help out with you, that's part of trying to create a holistic like financial health picture for those who have that amount of resources. So I guess my plug here is make sure your team is working for you on the financial side and on the health side as a team.
Yes.
To get to good outcomes.
I just found myself as being the communicator in chief and kind of getting these different stakeholders together when necessary.
I do have another question for you. Early on, you talked about fixed and variable costs, and you're talking about this book enterprise for these clients of yours.
Yeah.
I used to be a professional ballet dancer, and I will always need something creative. I think we should all do something creative and put, whatever that is. So maybe for this couple, there's like a creativity budget or something, or an entrepreneurship budget. And, this book
That's
endeavor
great.
is in that, framing, and it could change, to something else in, 5 or 6 years. Maybe it becomes something else. How can you help people think about, or what advice do you have for folks when it's, a fixed and variable things, right? What are the things that we really need to be able to be thinking about as we age?
Yeah. Well, I would break this into fixed, variable, and one-time costs. Fixed costs used to be something you didn't think too much about because we had low inflation. And even if we have low inflation for the next 10 years, we just had a period where some costs are pretty much permanently up. So some folks who aren't budgeting may not have their arms completely around what their cost structure looks like now on things like groceries or utilities.
Sorry to interrupt, John. I think this is a really important term that not everyone will know, as many of our listeners will and many will not.
Okay.
The concept of cost structure is actually like the infrastructure of spend that you have in your life, right? It's the infrastructure, like what is my cost? What am I spending on, right? So in very plain terms, can you just talk about this concept of cost structure?
So I'm referring to cost structure in a couple of ways. One is by simple category, right? So dining out, eating in, gardening, hardware, travel, utilities. And then another way is that fixed versus variable breakout of costs. Like within utilities, your electrical bill often has a fixed component. So even if you don't use any electricity at all, there's a certain flat amount you'll pay. And then there's a variable component that varies with your usage, right? And so there's even a kind of a structural difference within that category. So those are different ways of looking at costs in a structural way. Okay. And also on the income side, it can be very similar. There can be some income that is a fixed salary, and you can factor in a certain raise every year. or you may be in a profession that is all commission based and it's quite variable, and you need to make some assumptions and even guesses on what it could be. So I hope that answers a question about structure. I know we kind of throw that term out loosely, but those are different ways you could apply that concept.
I love that though, because it is important for us to get a handle on our costs. What are the things that we're spending on? Um, I know that looking at a budget can be really fraught for everyone and for a couple or for an individual. And one way to just think about it is, what is the structural cost of my life? I know the structure of my home. Maybe I know the structure of my refrigerator. I know what's in there. I know the structure. Okay, so let's think about the structure of the cost of our lives and start looking at that. And without that, it's going to be really hard to even plan ahead to understand if you've got resources to meet
Right.
scenario A or scenario B.
I think another thing that really strikes me here is the fact that when someone retires, they're operating on a fixed income at that point. They're no longer earning. You're operating entirely off of what you've banked away. Or, perhaps you have passive streams of income, but you're no longer employed classically. That is a lifestyle change. You're going to have to reassess naturally where you're spending your money, what you need for your core levers of your life, how you want those years to be, where do you want to reallocate your spend. It's a valuable exercise to do regardless. But then I think a lot of us will realize at that point how little understanding we actually have of our cost structures and the areas that we are actually investing and which of them are actually necessary and which of them we're not.
Exactly. Right. And it takes some critical thinking to do that. It also takes some sense of optimism.
So, John, at what point in an individual's life, I know you work primarily with seniors, at what point do your clients find you or seek out your services? For our listeners, if they are considering having a money manager or perhaps they don't have one, what's your guidance to them in terms of finding one and also when they should probably start talking to one?
Well, I know that there are money managers that are more wealth advisors that are quite aggressive in their marketing, and those are the people that a senior and their family may hear from first, completely unsolicited. And if you end up in a relationship with one of those folks, that I think just understanding that you will need some assistance very likely, and really drilling down on your budget, you should ask them for a referral to a daily money manager. And I am starting to build relationships with some certified financial planners and wealth advisors, but I know there are many out there who don't have any kind of alliances with daily money managers, and I think that will change over time. You can go to the American Association of Daily Money Managers website. That's aadmm.org, and you can find a lot of people with that same title. They don't all do what I'm doing. Some of them are strictly, they stay in their lane and they just do budgeting, and they just do Quicken reports. But I think there is a need for that for sure, but also a little bit more of being the glue that pulls all these different types of finance people together. That's why I'm calling a service personal CFO. So if anybody's interested in what I can provide, like to chat more for a free exploratory session, go to zenzonemoneymanagement.com, and there's a lot of info about what we can do, and contact information.
Absolutely. I want to make it very clear that neither Aaron nor I are getting anything out of partnering with John and advertising his services here, other than, of course, us believing that it would be of value to you. We will include John's information in our description and on our website, etc., for you to refer to if you didn't catch what he just plugged right there. But I would encourage you, if you are at any point in your life really evaluating your budgets and thinking through your spend, in terms of a daily money management scenarios, I highly recommend you check out his services or seek out a daily money manager in general for your expense management.
Two things, John, before we wrap up. The first that we have to ask about is Social Security, right? Like fixed income
Mm.
needs, the one not quite universal for people living in the US, but in general, if you've paid into the system and you're a US citizen and you meet all those like criteria of receiving Social Security, how would you encourage people to think about the future of Social Security? Because some of these things, as you say, like they're really bumpy, they're a little uncertain, they can cause a lot of anxiety. What would be something that you say for someone who's 60, like right now? How should they think about Social Security? And what about someone who's, 55?
Well, the last doomsday scenario that I heard about Social Security was that in 2033, the trust fund will not be able to make full payments. So if you're if you're going to turn 65 in 5 years, you have a little bit of time, but that's probably not too reassuring to everybody out there still. But we have had several crises in the past, and when Congress's backs were up against the wall, they pulled a rabbit out of the hat. They either, I remember in the 80s, they raised the payroll tax, but there are other mechanisms. The ceiling, so I think it's anything above $118,000 right now is not taxed for Social Security. That ceiling could certainly be raised. It is true that already the age at which you can get full Social Security is now 67 for most of its existence. The program had it at 65, it could go up to 70, but you will, no doubt, you will continue to have the option of taking Social Security early at age 62. But that said, with some uncertainty right now about the solvency of the program, I would urge people to plan to take Social Security a bit later and be able to fund their if they're taking an early retirement before 65, make sure that can be funded through other means.
Yeah, I think those points are really important for folks to consider, right? Like, one is Social Security is a really important program in the United States, and we have many different levers to keep some amount of money for folks as we get older. So those levers are things like you mentioned, where the amount of money that gets paid in for a paycheck. So if you make, I don't remember the exact terms, we'll figure it out and put it online, but right now, if you make $200,000 a year, and there are people who make that amount of money, their Social Security contribution hits a ceiling at like 116 or 120 or 130.
118,
so for very high earners, that percentage of their money that's above that amount isn't being paid into, and they don't expect to get back. So there are levers there. There are levers in terms of when to start taking it. There are also levers in terms of how much it can pay out. So maybe it will pay out less than it currently does, but it will still pay out some amount, or maybe it will move differently with inflation. But there, to your point, people, it makes sense to be able to expect Social Security to some degree as we get older, given the fact that it's been around now and there have been movements to kill it or cut it and change it, and it still exists. So, but I think your point is also well taken around trying to find other funding mechanisms too, and not take the system for granted and believe it's going to be there in the form it is today. Later, I think that's also true. It will look different. It looks different now than it even did, 10, 15 years ago, right? So it's going to look different in 15 years than it looks today. So then we like to end with, if we had 60 seconds, if we could just take 60 seconds right now to pay ourselves forward, what would you suggest people do for 60 seconds today to pay themselves forward?
Well, I would think about where they are in life, where they want to be in, say, 5 years. Think about one goal, because you only have 60 seconds, that you want to achieve in 5 years. And then start to think backwards, reverse engineer to the steps that you need to take to get there. And I will bet you most of these goals have a cost and that you will need some sort of a process that involves your finances to get there. And it could just get down to plain old discipline and having a coffee jar that you throw cash into, or the virtual coffee jar in this day and age.
I love that. There are virtual coffee jars. There's behavioral economics that shows if you can't see the money that you're saving, then you don't
Yeah.
use it, right? That's a
Yeah.
real thing. So I think that's an awesome way to end today with that advice. Think about a goal that you want in 5 years, spend 60 seconds on that. Say, okay, what is that goal? Think a little bit about how you would get there and a little bit about how much it costs to get there. And then figure out how to set up some sort of cookie jar, cookies for the future, right? Get to that goal in 5 years. John, I think that's great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time today. Really enjoyed having you here. If you listen to the podcast and you want to follow up with us or with John, you can see links on our YouTube channel. You can reach out to us at podcast@pomastay.com and we will be in touch. Thank you for your time and spend those 60 seconds thinking about your future.
Thank you so much, John. It was great chatting with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Look forward to working with you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Well,
This is becoming a favorite moment in my day.
good, good.
The
I mean,
debriefs.
yeah, I love our after episode chats. I think there's so much to think about from every episode, which is so fun.
There's so much to reflect on from John's conversation. So yesterday or the day before, I was speaking with someone who is a certified financial planner who's talking about all of the needs around managing money as we get older for people who have like meaningful real estate, because the decision to sell it, how to sell it, when to sell it, what it means for potential care, what it means for conversations around the couple themselves, the family, it just becomes a lot, and one person's job just to manage that, and then also what you do with that, because who knows whether or not as we start getting older, people are actually paying their bills, if they're like how we're shopping, all the subscription payments that exist right now for all these things. Like, are you using them now? Do you need them? Like, is that preventing you from getting like some extra other type of care that might be useful? It's just like, it's so much. So hearing his perspective and how that industry is also potentially growing, I thought was really interesting.
I think also one thing I want to bring up here is not everybody is able to afford a wealth manager or even has enough
100%.
assets to justify having a wealth manager. I think it would be really valuable for the people who can't have a wealth manager or don't want to have a wealth manager to consider daily money management. Budgeting is still very difficult. You need to make sure that your money can go as far as it can. Just because you don't have a whole team of accountants and estate managers, etc., doesn't mean you can't benefit from a service like John's or even equivalent, even an app or something like that to manage your money can go a long way.
Yeah, to do that initial cost like assessment, maybe even annually, kind of like we were talking about with medication management, like do an audit of medication, once a year. Like, are you on the stuff that you need to be on? Are you on too much? Okay, what am I spending on once a year? Is this what I need to be spending on? Regardless of whether or not you've got a lot or a little, as we get older and we move into more of a fixed income situation, I think it makes a ton of sense to do that.
I mean, you and I I've recently started exploring Monarch Money. I know you are a big fan, and I think even just the labeling of spend is really valuable, just to know exactly what buckets I'm investing in every month. I have a rough budget that I follow, but even the Monarch breakdown was incredibly insightful to me. I felt like I was like, oh, maybe I am over-indexing in this specific area. Maybe I should adjust. I don't actually need all of that, So I think it's really valuable even when you're not operating off of a retirement fund.
100%. What Ashwini is talking about right now is an app that is accessible online and on your phone, and it's called Monarch Money, and it allows people to connect their accounts to one interface to look at their transactions, look at their net worth. You can add your home to it. You can add a car to it, and it pings a Zillow API or something else to like get updates on net worth. Um, I don't have any formal kickbacks from it. If someone does want a referral, I get a month free because I pay for it. So like I can give you my link and then you can, get it. But I don't have we don't have Ashwini and I, neither one of us nor Bombas has like a relationship with Monarch Money, the
They want
application.
to partner with us though.
But if you do, yeah, Monarch, if you want to partner with us, great call out. We are both benefiting from that. But there is a cost to that. That's one of those other subscriptions where like we pay, I don't remember what it is, $10 a month, $15 a month to track that, but it's a useful tool. So like this concept of passively updating people too on stuff is super helpful, right? There's this information that, and my wife no longer has to tell me something because I can just see it. I no longer have to tell something because she can just see it.
I think there's also you don't know what you need to share, right? Sometimes these things are so small that you don't want to think about, oh, do I need to tell my spouse? Do I need to not? I don't know. And it builds up over time. It's just easier for people to just check it on their own, perhaps, and then bring it up if it's something they want to discuss. I was also reflecting a bit on what John was saying around people not having the documentation they need for their accountants and for their tax purposes. I know a lot of us are relatively organized when it comes to those kinds of things because you want to minimize the amount you're spending and you want to optimize your tax return. But for those of you that are struggling with your documentation or may not know what information you actually need to store and track, having someone who is an expert in this space to provide that guidance will save you potentially a lot on your return.
Ashwini, I'm interested in your thoughts on always, but on this topic specifically. So John said something today about all the scenario planning that people want help with, and you and I've been talking to a ton of folks independently and together, and something that comes up is people suddenly need to make a decision when like an event or a diagnosis happens. That's when people actually have certainty, and I wonder what your thoughts are on that, because in some ways, seeing all those scenarios could be helpful. It's also overwhelming because there's always another conversation. Like how do you reflect on that, right? Like how do you reflect on, okay, actually, I kind of have a broad scope of what the future is going to look like, but now that something's happened, now I got to take action, right? Like how do we manage that?
Yeah. I think if I put myself in the shoes of someone who has gotten, say, all the different permutations of the possible outcomes, I inherently will consider, since I think I lean more optimistic, I would inherently consider the positive outcomes of, say, me living to be 110 or something like that, as opposed to, say, me experiencing something negative in the near future, or my spouse experiencing something negative in the near future. So I think even though I'd be presented with all the outcomes, I might not take them all seriously. And as a result, I may not be as prepared as I might need to be for certain outcomes, which is a soft conversation that, I would need someone to actually have with me to kind of remind me to consider those scenarios.
Yeah, I think so. And but I think that we can also help folks by aggregating some of these stories. You and
Mhm.
I've talked about that too, where, if you're listening to the podcast, send us an email and we'd like to talk with you, because Ashwini and I are working on ways, both with businesses and with people, like in outside of like a business context, to help, us all understand where we are in our progression of aging, because we could be 40, but maybe there are other things we need to be considering.
Yeah.
Maybe we could be 50 and there are other things. Maybe we could be 80 and actually we're doing great. So like,
And we've
what are
ever
those
been,
things?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, um, this point, like when we reach a decision point or when we reach a diagnosis, or how to think about where we are on a spectrum of aging and what we're going to need. If you'd like some help thinking through that, or a framework, um, we will have something on our website soon to help with that, but also a conversation with you around what you felt useful or not. We'd love to get your feedback so we can help others who might have been in the same situation or similar situation.
The goal here with Palm State is for us to all kind of feel less alone in this experience, but also more educated so that we can navigate this with strength.
Thank you for joining the Palm State podcast today with John Hall, and for leaning into the conversations related to managing your costs and your spend. We hope it provided some interesting conversational material for you and your loved ones regarding budgeting, and provided some things to think about regarding fixed income and other financial situations. To make sure you don't miss out on our next conversation, please subscribe. You can also visit our website at palmistay.com for more insights and resources on the topics we cover. Share our podcast on social media. Of course, we are on x.com. And please message your family and WhatsApp groups. It's a great way for others to discover the conversations that you've been a part of and that we've been talking about. And we appreciate your support, and we'll see you next time.